not sure. You guys, I have it right here in front of me, so I don't necessarily have to have it back there. I'm not sure. It was on just a minute ago. Can you just hit those power buttons? Yeah, that's all needed. And on the other one as well. That blue light will show up in the bottom to let us know that we're going. There we go. So I should be able to see that. Yep. We introduced the elder-preacher relationship. I wanted to just say a few things about that before we look at some other material within this particular unit. If you're looking at your syllabus, this is under, I don't know how I have it exactly, the preacher and the elders or something along those lines. Do you see that? Or if you look at your syllabus, you'll see it there. And so we're to the point to ask, what are some of the key ingredients that will help preachers and elders develop a great relationship? Remember, we looked at Paul and the Ephesian elders that met together in Miletus and the relationship that they had and how it was characterized. And we said that there have been elders that have not been the best. There are preachers that have not been the best. But we can have a great relationship, but what does it take? So with that in mind, the first thing I want us to notice there that you see in front of you is communication. As we said in the counseling with regard to marriage, that communication is the number one reason why couples go to seek counsel. One of the greatest shortcomings and failings in the elder-preacher relationship revolves around communication. And there needs to be communication particularly about the roles that each one plays and the responsibilities. That's those mutual expectations that you see there. The preacher needs a firm grasp of what the elders see as his job. The preacher needs to know what the elders see as his job. Now, how do you do that? Well, what you have there in that jumble pile I gave you was a working agreement in which there's a job description. I would want, when I go into local work, I want to know those written expectations. What do they conceive of as my work? In fact, and this is the way it worked for us, we made an initial agreement to come here, but they sent a working agreement for me to look at. So I have an idea before we seal the deal exactly what they envision as the job, and there were revisions in that. I sent back and said, hey, what about this? And it was either yes or no. And so we got some things revised on that. And what you're going to find is the longer that you're there, there's going to be minor clarification in your role. You get there, they see your strengths and your weaknesses, and there'll be adjustments made in your expectations. But where is your outline for what you're supposed to do? 2 Timothy 4:1-8. So there's God's major expectations for you. And in regard to role and responsibility, there also needs to be a clear understanding that only elders can serve in the role as pastors and overseers. Preachers don't have an authority for that. Now, there's going to be some visiting that we do that's pastoral in nature. I mean, they hate to call it by that name. But when you go and see somebody in the hospital and you're providing comfort for them, what are you doing? But you are not the pastor. Even though most places that you go, someone who is perhaps weak in the faith or new, or even non-Christians, of course, that are there, will often call you pastor. You'll get called pastor all the time in the community. How do you handle that? Hi, I'm John Smith. Hi, I'm Neal Pollard. Well, good to meet you, pastor. And so I say there, I just met him. No, the Bible says that if the pastor is an elder, and so they speak to us that way. I have learned through the years, that's when you let slide. That's like, there's A to Z. That's like X or Y. We got a lot more to establish before we get to that point. That's a more minor, secondary thing. But you'll have folks come up to you in the foyer, and you'll find out they've been Christians for 15, 20 years, and they'll call you pastor. What does that reflect?
Don't know much.
Little lack of depth there. They haven't really grown, and there's various reasons for that. But we've got to make sure that we do what we can to resist falling into that denominational mold in the minds of people. I'll tell you, even in the Bible Belt, there are some guys that, they are the guy. And they are seen in that way. They would never call themselves pastor, but that's their de facto. That's what they do. The elders never take a shepherding facet to their role. And the preacher, if anything pastoral is done by him. So there has to be a clear understanding. I think in one of the first few classes, I mentioned a book written by a community church guy in this area. And despite that, it is a very good, in many ways, very biblical book. I'll give you the resource, and you can look for it. You probably find it pretty cheap on Amazon at this point. But the book is called Biblical Eldership. And the author is Alexander Strauch, S-T-R-A-U-C-H. And he says in his thesis for writing the book that it is an attempt to help to restore the biblical model for church leadership. I was just surprised by that. I don't know that he's still in the area. I looked him up when I first taught this class a couple of years ago, and I couldn't find him, but I may have missed him. Here's what he says in the book. He says, the contemporary church board concept of eldership is irreconcilably at odds with the New Testament definition of eldership. According to the New Testament concept of eldership, elders lead the church, teach and preach the word, protect the church from false teachers, exhort and admonish the saints in sound doctrine, visit the sick and pray, and judge doctrinal issues. Now, do you have any fault with that at all? Shouldn't an elder be able to preach and teach the word?
Yeah.
I mean, he seemed to draw all this out of 1 Timothy chapter 3. And he says, he emphasizes strongly the shepherding aspect of elders, saying that elders are to be viewed as primarily pastors of the flock, not corporate executives, not CEOs or advisors to the preacher. But I think that's a pretty accurate.
What's his name?
His name is Alexander Strauch, S-T-R-A-U-C-H. And so the elders need to be seen in that role. And we've said it already before, I don't want to belabor the point, but we're going to make those visits. We're going to counsel. We're going to be involved in various facets that help to nurture people. But we've got to make sure that we do all that we can to divert that idea in members' minds toward the elders. Now, how can we do that? Publicly, what we say. I have tried to encourage elderships to be involved in the counseling process. Because if we're given pastoral counsel, aren't they the ones that should be providing that? So that in turn, what happens? If the elders take the time to sit down with those with troubles, what kind of feeling do they begin to have toward them? A lot of times the way that they typically feel toward the preacher. They look to them for guidance. They look to them for help. And that's what we want to establish. All right, there also needs to be communication about mutual expectations. What do you expect of elders? What should they expect of you? You know, it's dangerous, but it's dangerously common to assume that we know what the other person is thinking. Nobody is a mind reader. And yet sometimes preachers and elders proceed as though they know what the other's thinking, or that the other party knows what they're thinking, and they don't. So what should drive our expectations of elders? Nothing more than Hebrews 13:17, 1 Timothy 3:1-8, Titus 1:5-11, and 1 Peter 5:1-4. These are just the passages that speak about the eldership. So I'll give them to you again. It's Hebrews 13:7 and 17, 1 Timothy 3:1-8, Titus 1:5-11, 1 Peter 5:1-4. You can throw in Acts 20:28 in there as well, because they are to shepherd the flock.
1 Peter what?
1 Peter 5:1-4. Peter said, the elders which are among you I exhort, whom also an elder, to be an example of the flock, not lording it over them. I once wrote an article entitled, What God Does Not Expect of Elders. And let me give you the 4 main points from that, because I think it's so important. What God does not expect of elders. Number 1, He does not expect more than the qualifications specify. What do I mean? Well, God does not need our help. He doesn't need us to tack on additional expectations beyond what He felt the need to supply for us. Let me tell you why I'm giving you this. Through the years, I have known a few preachers who, when they go, no matter where they go, and I have known them in multiple works. All right, so they go from church A to church B, even I've seen C and D. And wherever they are, no matter what, there were never men qualified to serve as elders. And when you begin to dig a little deeper, what you find at the very bottom of this is a power struggle or an insecurity about others having authority or them having to submit to somebody else. That's not just women's role that brings this up. A lot of folks have problems with submission in our culture. And so he'll begin to say, well, I don't think he's qualified. And you begin to look, and he's adding things that aren't in Scripture. So that's the first thing. Number two, he does not expect perfection. Man, you find me the person that's going to be perfect in every one of these areas in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. And so as you dig a little deeper into that, he expects maturity. 1 Timothy 3:6. He expects ability. Titus 1 and verse 9. He expects stability. 1 Timothy 3, 4, and 5. So maturity, ability, and stability, but not impeccability. You know, it's an interesting thing to me. One time I was asked to speak on, I was given a loaded topic of lectureship. It was called, versions versus perversions. So you kind of see that they're stacking the deck a little bit on with it. They thought there were perversions among some of the versions. But as I went through that, I said that a lot of times what we do is we use almost a toothless comb, because this was a group that would have been inclined to think that King James was about the only thing there was and nothing else really was worthwhile. And you kind of use a toothless comb on that one, but you use a 1,000-tooth comb on New American Standard, even the New King James, and certainly the NIV. You know, just minutia all in there. And I make some points, and the thing that got me the most in trouble was when I began to show some of the flaws in the King James. I had a guy that got up behind me. His subject was completely different, something else. And he spent 5 minutes trying to defend the passages that I referred to from the King James. That, for example, King James is renowned for translating the active voice in the Greek into the passive voice. How about Acts chapter 2? The Lord added to the church daily. It's Acts 3:19. Repent and be converted. Be converted. Instead of repent and turn. That's what the Greek says. It's active, see. And I gave several examples of that. And that was just not, but that's because we revered. And now we said, what does that do with elders? All right, you have an eldership already in place, right? You have 3 or 4 men. They're there. They've been there for a while. And so there's 2 or 3 other men that are going to be considered to serve as an elder. What do? They begin to look with that 1,000-tooth comb. Look into their family. Look into their children. Every little thing, they're looking for that. But let's turn that around and use that on the men that are already serving. What would we find? Some of the same stuff. But see, we got to be very careful. And as a preacher, we find ourselves in a position to be the voice of reason. To say, now let's be careful. Not to expect perfection of these men, because they are not going to be perfect. So, God does not expect perfection. Number 3, he does not expect elders to neglect their own families. We as preachers need to preach the importance of them being good husbands and being good fathers if they happen to have children who are still at home.
He does not expect what?
Elders to neglect their own families. You know, the same stuff we said about preachers and how you need to make sure you protect your family life. Elders are entitled to that same right and privilege. Because I'll tell you guys, the whole family sacrifices. They themselves are put under the microscope when a man is selected to serve as an elder. And, number 4, he does not expect elders to be the complaint-receiving committee. That begins with us, but that also extends to our protecting them from I don't want to call them ne'er-do-wells, but the folks that were, what is it they say, that were born in the objective case and the kicking mood, you know, they're always, if the elders see them coming, it's because they got some aggravation, some complaint they need to share. And what I have done is I have reminded in sermons, when the elders see you coming, what do they expect? When is the last time that you approached the elders just commending them, thanking them for their work, without any kind of, you need to do this, and I don't like this, and the other? Because that's not what, now shepherds understand, leaders understand, that's part of the job. But you're going to hear some of that. But we need to make sure that we balance that out. So that's something for us to remember. And it includes us. As preachers, we can fall into that trap. That we're always saying, this is what's wrong, this is what you need to do, this is what we need to do, and not just taking the moment to say, or write them a note and say, I just want you to know I appreciate you and the good work that you do. I know you've made sacrifices. They need to hear that.
What was the point?
He does not expect elders to be the complaint receiving committee. And the one who has the greatest impact on members' attitude toward the elders is the preacher. I know I can't give you a book, chapter, and verse for that, but common sense and your own experience will tell you that. How you speak of them, if you praise them and defend them, publicly and privately, the members will follow suit. All right, so that's one half of it. So if we've talked about us as preachers having reasonable expectations of the elders, it's right that elders have reasonable expectations of the preacher. Sometimes they don't. Or it can happen that way. A fellow by the name, those numbers up there, they're going to make sense to you now. Joe Riggs was a preacher from the Nashville area that conducted a survey, pretty widely published survey. It involved several hundred people. He asked members how they felt that the preacher should spend his time in local work. Okay? So here was the result of that study. They said that he should spend 65% in sermon preparation. So as they're asking the members, all right, here's 100% that the preacher gets. Of that time, how much should he spend in sermon preparation? All right, so they picked a number. They said 65% of his time should be spent in sermon preparation. 25% in general church work. I'm not sure what that is. If that's the bulletin, if that's... really not sure. Answering the phone, I don't know. It is general church work. 25% of the time. 45% of his time, almost half, in public relations. Going down to elementary school and shaking hands with the kids as they go in, you know, or going down to McDonald's and drinking coffee with the fellas.
Talking about the old days.
That's right, yeah. 60% of his time in counseling. And there are a lot of problems you have to deal with, you know. %80 of his time should be spent in visiting non-members. And this one struck me, the last one, 85% of his time in visiting members. That's the highest number. He should be in our homes and visiting with us. Now, I aren't a math genius, but you put all those numbers together, they don't equal 100%, do they? That's 360%, if my math is right.
I think you need 3+ preachers.
That's it, 3.5 of them at least. Or maybe you need to educate members about some things. But elders are going to take a lead there. And there's not, you're not going to face a 360% expectation from the congregation where you go, but different people are going to expect that you ought to be doing different things, but you're not there to try to placate and fill the expectations of all those members. If you have elders, or if you have a men's business meeting, wherever decisions are made, that's where those kind of expectations need to come. That's where that working agreement comes in. And that's where a calm, rational response that says, well, I'll tell you, I'm working diligently. And I'm doing all that I can. And I think you'll see that I'm not a lazy person. So don't be a lazy person. Be industrious, and your work will follow you, and people will see that. Yes, sir.
Can you go for the numbers again, please?
Uh-huh. Well, the numbers you have up there on the PowerPoint. You just need to know what goes with them, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so 65, sermon preparation. 25, tell me, are you needing all of those?
I need 25, 45, 80.
Okay, 25 is general church work. Which I'm not even sure, I didn't identify what all that was.
45.
45 is public relations. I don't know if you don't go down and hang out at McDonald's on Dominica. Where do you go?
By the sea.
Oh, just go by the sea? Okay. There's always somewhere that they need you to go. And then what was the other one? 80?
Yes.
Visiting non-members. All right, that's all I want to say about that unless you guys have a question. Let's go on to the a second ingredient for a good relationship is commendation. And I wonder how many preachers and elders have quit simply from a feeling of a lack of appreciation and encouragement and recognition. We don't serve for that reason, but we benefit from it. I've got so much more I want to say, but we've got so much ground to cover. Let me just say this. Hypercriticism is a spiritual problem.
Hypercriticism?
Hypercriticism.
And
Hypercriticism is just criticizing everything. It's kind of like hyperglycemia versus hypoglycemia.
that sounds bad.
It does, yeah. Either one's not good. I finally think another hyper, but hyper too much, hypo not enough.
Oh.
All right, so.
What's hippo?
But hypocrite is
Pretty good.
not enough what they ought to be. Those are not two words that actually correlate, so that's an exception to the rule. Hypercriticism. Those that just are nitpicking about everything. 1 Thessalonians 5:11, we're to build up each other. And we're to help others be the best that they can be. That's 1 Timothy 4:16. Elders and preachers both need to hear public commendation from the other. Isn't that fair, guys? You preach on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Doesn't it make you feel a little bit extra measure of security if an elder gets up behind there and says, I want to appreciate Brother Brad for that sermon that he's preached. It wasn't easy for him to do. But we stand with him on that. Man, that's a place where you can lock down and stay. But what about you? You get up there and say, Brother Frank and Brother Bill are just two godly men. We're so grateful for them and the great way that they lead us to follow the Lord. And we need to make sure we thank them. I mean, that's just takes. How much time did that take out of your life? How much effort was that? And yet, what dividends will that pay in their confidence, in their feelings of encouragement? All right, well, more to say, but I'm going to go ahead and move on. Cooperation. We're a team. Each group needs to ask this question frequently. What am I doing to build my relationship with my elders/preacher? So how do you build your relationship with your elders?
Spending time with them.
All right, you have to spend time with them. So how can you do that? What are some practical ways that you do that? Okay. You go visit with them. What else?
Work on projects.
Find out what hobbies they have.
Okay. And then as a follow-up to that, engage in them.
Yeah.
I've played tennis with elders. there was an elder in Virginia. We lived in a Civil War area, and so we relic hunted. And he had a wayward son for a time, and so we went out and we took that up together, and that son is restored, still faithful today. But we continued to relic hunt. And I enjoy it. You know, you visit. You're not. It's kind of like regular hunting. You don't talk when you're in the woods, but when you come out, you know, you're visiting, and there's on the way back, and just doing something together with somebody builds a bond. I've gone on vacation with elders, worked at camp with elders, gone on mission trips. I tell you, it revolutionized the way that I look at Clint and Maynard and Ernie. I went to Cambodia with them 2 or 3, 4 years ago, and we're sitting on top of the roof of our hotel. And this morning we have devotion every morning. And here's Maynard sitting in his chair, a little straw chair, barefooted, just kind of hanging out. How many times do you see your elder barefooted? You know, he's kind of hanging out with in his pajamas, and it just changes. It's not the same anymore, you know. And going and seeing things together with them, and having funny things happen to you as you travel, and you're especially in a foreign place. You know, Clint got sick, and Clint got lost when we went to a temple on the one day we had to go sightseeing, and we razz him even to this day about that. It's just, you know, it's what happens. That's a part of building a relationship. You need to look for opportunities. Play softball, you know, whatever, like you say, whatever their interests are. Go to lectureships and seminars with them. Have them into your home. I think I told you about the elder I went and played a prank on the girls, didn't I? In their cabin. We're at church camp. I thought I told you all that. And so I went there, and this elder had the idea. It's like 2:30 in the morning. And he said, let's go down there and put a rope around there. You know, they had those little aluminum shutters, you know. You can envision in your mind. Had little wood props. So we ran the rope through there. And so we had another guy that had made great animal noises. And so he started sounding like all kind of different animals. And then Dave yanked that rope, and then boom, all those shutters came out at the same time. And it was the elder that came up with that. As far as I know, he hasn't gone forward for that yet. We had a good time. And think about how that changes how you relate with them day by day. We should be doing that kind of thing. I think, well, not necessarily. I don't know that he would have duplicated the prank again, but those are the kinds of things that build a relationship. That doesn't mean that you'll always be of one mind on judgment matters. You won't be of one mind on plans. You'll propose something, they'll say, no, we can't do it, we can't afford it, it's not right for the congregation or whatever. You're going to be frustrated with one another, I guarantee you. A lot of times, especially when you begin preaching, your wheels are moving a whole lot faster in your mind than theirs are, the wheels of progress. And it'll feel like it's taking them forever. Some of that may be immaturity and experience on your part. Some of it may be problems on their part. But what will make you be a team is a recognition of a few things. Everybody must realize that God wants the church to grow. Elders want the church to grow. Preachers need to want the church to grow. You think, well, why would elders and preachers not want the church to grow? There are some of each that don't. You may encounter the philosophy that I like a congregation this size. I don't want it any bigger, because then we won't know each other. Well, is that really? I mean, there are ways to handle that. If you feel like you're getting too large, what can you do? You could plan another congregation. But that's an elder's call. The elders may say, no, we want to keep our resources together because we can do more as a congregation by way of mission, by way of the community, if we're here together. Or you'll have a preacher say, I don't want to preach for a church that size. I want us to stay this size. Or it could be, though this might not ever be confessed, I'm afraid of losing control. I'm afraid of losing power, authority, influence if we grow any bigger. But both elders and preachers must be united and cooperate in church growth. They need to understand that God wants His leaders firmly entrenched at Calvary.
Neal,
Yes.
not wanting the church to grow. That's that. Did we ever have that? What I should that mandate to decide whether we want the church to grow?
No.
I thought we are the ones that just supposed to plant and not with the increase.
That's exactly right. And I mean, you begin to think about. We don't think about the alternatives to that statement. If we don't grow, it's hard to. Status quo is not going to happen. If you're not growing, you are dying. If you're not growing, you're shrinking. It's just inevitable because people are dying. People are moving away. You're either growing or you're not. And to not grow is you're going the other direction. So no, we don't. We don't have a say in that. Our job is to help the church to grow as much as possible, to help the kingdom grow. That's why it's great to baptize our children. It's great to baptize even non-Christian mates that attend, but we need to be looking in the community and helping to grow the kingdom. Or when people come from other congregations in the area, or they move in from out of the area, the church is not growing, the kingdom is the same size. We need to reach out into our community. Number 3, we must recognize that the unity of 1 Corinthians 12 and Ephesians 4 is most influentially modeled by them. Who has the most influence in effecting the unity of 1 Corinthians 12 and Ephesians 4? God's leaders do. And we don't lead in the same way the elders do, but preachers are leaders. We stand before the congregation several times a week. All right, well, I got so much more to say on that, but I'm going to move on for sake of time here. Any questions? Anybody not get something? Okay. Let me just give you this before we move out of this unit. Preachers and elders. What do I owe the elders? That's kind of the lead statement to this list that you have here. What do I owe the elders? Number 1, I owe the elders fairness and honesty. So that means you're going to live up to all the agreements that you have with them. The written agreements and the verbal agreements. Now, let me show you some practical areas where fairness and honesty are important. Never hold it over the elder's head, the thought or the idea that you're going to move if you have no intention to. It's just a threat or just a manipulative ploy. Of course, that can backfire, can't it?
Yeah.
I've seen it. I have been in the room when that happened. Somebody said, well, if this, and this don't occur, then, you can just find somebody else to do this job. And the elders conferred after he left. They drafted a letter. I didn't see the final copy, but I got to hear the draft. And they sent it to him saying, we sure appreciate your great years of service. And we wish you Godspeed in your next endeavor. So be careful. But even if that doesn't happen, it's not fair and it's not honest to say, well, it's kind of like if you don't play by my rules and take my ball and going home, it's immature and it's not spiritual. Another way that this has a practical application. Never convey to the elders to their faces that they're great men and wonderful men, and then have a different message about them to individual members or behind their back. So does that mean just as long as it's honest, it's okay to say? We need to be fair, don't we? There's some things that can be said honestly about us that we might not want said. And you know the old adage, right? Ask yourself, is it true? Is it kind? Is it of any value? So we owe the elders fairness and honesty. Number 2, we owe them assurance. The elders should know that the preacher will be there, that he has that idea, that he's come to stay. And that's changed some. I was just in Calvert City, Kentucky, and I was blown away. That's western Kentucky, right up near Illinois, and just not too far from Tennessee. All those guys, and I forget the name of those counties, there's like 3 counties that go together. Everywhere, those guys had been there 17, 20, 25 years. I was amazed at that. I told you I was a preacher's kid. I grew up at a time when preachers had a different philosophy. They said, the Apostle Paul, where's the longest he was anywhere? 3 years, right? So I'm going to be somewhere no more than 3 years. And so they would be there, and of course that was a time when they had parsonages more. They didn't allow the preacher to buy his own house as much. And so you just come, you move into that house, you work there a little while, then you move on to the next place. And it was very hard for them to be established in the community, to really take the time to build relationships. And so there needs to be an assurance from your end that I'm not here for just 10 months and then I'm moving on. I have the idea in coming here that I want to stay. It may not work out that way, but you should have that mentality.
I think Bear Valley drilled that into my head since day one.
Oh, really? Well, I think you'll find the longer you are somewhere, the more effective you can be.
Mark talks about that a lot.
Yeah, well, yeah, he modeled that. He was in Montrose for 17 years.
And clout. That's what I'm
Yeah, there you go.
Cloud. Well, Maxwell has some good stuff about levels of leadership. And whenever you go from point A to point B, I think there's 5 levels of leadership. You go down to level 1 as soon as you walk out the door and go to the next place, because you're no longer known, you're no longer trusted, you're no longer entrenched, you no longer have that clout. That's a good way to put it. Number 3, understanding. You owe the elders understanding. And this kind of goes back to what we've said. There's no perfect preachers, and there are no perfect elders. Be patient. I mean, these are spiritual men. They're going to have weaknesses.
Did you say we owe them understanding?
Understanding. That's correct. Now, if you guys can see, I'm working down that list right there. Yeah. So number 3. So now number 4, cooperation. That's self-explanatory. As long as preachers and elders are united, there are no problems that can't be solved. Now, I know that's one of those universal statements. I'm sure we can find an exception, but you're a whole lot harder pressed to find an inconquerable problem. I mean, there's some bad things that can happen in a local work situation. You think about Parker. Now, they don't have elders. You have you have the men there who serve in a position of spiritual leadership, and you have Wayne, who's a great man. That's a hard thing to deal with when somebody commits suicide. Number 5 is prayers. Make a commitment to pray for your elders by name daily. Don't be that guy in Matthew chapter 6 that's doing his acts of spiritual service to be seen of men. But I don't think it's out of line to let your elders know, hey, I want you to know I pray for you. I'll tell you, I've never had anybody tell me that, but it didn't make me feel empowered and better as a result of that. Number 6, assistance in planning and execution. When they outline a work, we should be ready to carry the ball, help them any way we can. Number 7, of course, we owe the elders a faithful declaration of God's Word. Remember that the local pulpit is under the eldership. I know we get our marching orders from God's Word, but we are also in subjection to that local eldership. Now, what happens if there's a conflict? They say you can't preach on these particular subjects because it'll offend the members, and they're clearly stated principles in God's Word. Well, obviously, in that case, you have to submit to the one to whom all men must submit. That's Christ.
It's kind of odd to think that a preacher might lose his position, and let's just say it's not doctrinal. It's just some unfortunate happening. The 3 elders dismissed him, so the preacher's gone. But then 4 months later, those 3 elders aren't there. There's new 3 elders. And if those 3 elders were there, that former preacher would still have his position. If, you can think like that would be a possible situation, so it's odd to think how it can go.
And I'm sure that preacher might deal with some discouragement and confusion. And what I would remind him of is that we have a sovereign God who's in charge of it all. And I have yet, of course I'm only 43, but I have yet to see a situation where God could not take whatever it was and put me in a better place than I was. And that doesn't necessarily mean financially, doesn't necessarily mean everything that I might want, but as I let my life be in His control, you might say, well, that's not fair. If it were different, I'd still be there. But see, God, if you say, all right, God, I'm still a tool in your hand, and God's going to put you somewhere else. Maybe God was delivering you, because that's instability. But you're right. You can think that way. But as the way the cards were being dealt at that time, that was your eldership, and that was the way.
Yeah.
And that's letting go can be so difficult, because that's what would come from that. There'd be the what ifs, the regrets, and we don't need to live life looking in the rearview mirror. We need to look in the glass ahead of us there and keep moving that direction. But that kind of thing might happen in your preaching life, and it's dealing with that makes a difference. It's how God can continue to use you as you move ahead. With regard to this, what we're talking about, I would suggest, just as a matter of practicality, that you ask the elders about twice a year what they think you should be preaching. Invite them to weigh in on, the flock. And see now maybe that'll encourage them to know the flock even better. But you say, you know the flock. What should I be, is there something I'm not preaching that I should be? A lot of times we'll hear, no, we appreciate what you're doing, just keep on doing that. But I value when elders say, and when you do that, what do? Is you open a door, and hopefully you have the right kind of relationship that they'll call you up and say, I was thinking, I really think it'd be great if we preached some lessons on church discipline. We don't really have that process going on right now. Now, what you have to be careful about. Be careful that you don't have one guy speaking unilaterally who has an agenda or an axe to grind. But assuming, in most cases, that's not the case. But he's saying he's thoughtful. And here he is on Tuesday morning. He's at his job. And he calls you in your study. Or he calls you on your cell phone, gets a hold of you, and says that. And I think that's wonderful. Here's an elder who's not at church services. He's during the week. And he calls me and he says, this is what I want you to preach about. And I've had that happen before. I love that. And I do my very best to put that at the top of the pile and preach that as soon as I can. Because they're shepherding. They're stepping up and working in that position as an elder. And I want to validate that any way I can.
Do you take those suggestions from just one elder, or do you not take it from in a meeting?
It depends on the elder. I'd say of all the elders I've ever served under, none here, I have never known, but I've only known one elder that was a bit unilateral in his disposition, and I would have taken with caution what he would have suggested. But otherwise, yes, that's the main means I'm talking about. Is in an elders preachers meeting saying, what do you guys think I need to be preaching? So you're giving them all a chance. And they may discuss it together and then give you some suggestions at the next time you meet. Or they may have some right there. The pulpit is the way that the elders feed the flock. So you're a means by which they are doing, or one of the means by which they do what God's given them the task to do. All right, number 8. You owe the elders commendation. And I'm not talking about flattery or false praise, but sincere praise. And keep this in mind, that people often live up to the expectations of others. So as you commend them, you may be helping them to improve. You're not manipulating them. You're sincere. That's just a side benefit of that. Number 9, you owe them information. Now, it's exceptional here. I think we have a very well-informed eldership about matters going on in our brotherhood. Clint's going to polishing the pulpit every year. That's an issue-oriented venue, but he does the kind of things that gets him plugged in to what's going on in our brotherhood. You have two former preachers in the eldership, and so they have contacts and they know what's going on. But the other two men are well-informed men. But sometimes they're not going to know what's going on in the brotherhood. Not that that's what you spend all your time with, but you do keep them informed. They look at you as a resource. They can help them in that way. But here's a big thing I'm talking about here. If you are involved in the life of the congregation, you are a valuable resource for giving them in-house information. For example, it's only been very recently that I think all of our elders now have a Facebook account. I'm not sure about Ernie, but Sharon does. Facebook tells you a lot, doesn't it? It will tell you, when I go to local work, make friends with this. Anybody that has Facebook, teenagers, young adults, everybody, because it will help you. We Christians, new Christians, you say, whatever happened to brother so-and-so? You can go in there and you say, well, I can tell you he's been doing this and that and the other, you know. Not that you're tattletelling, but you have information that elders need in order to properly shepherd. But you'll also know that because you're involved in their lives and because you know who they are. And that's something that's very helpful to the elders' work, is you being able to give them information. Did you know that brother and sister so-and-so have been dealing with some illness lately? And that's why, or their daughter is sick and they had to go out of state. Now, those are the kinds of things that can help them. They're not omniscient, so they could use our help, and we need to be able to supply that. Number 10, we owe them defense. The elders have the right to expect that we're going to defend them. And he should expect that elders are going to do the same for him. Defend him. Now, I'm not talking about against indefensible things. But I mean those run-of-the-mill circumstances where it's good to know that they have your back and you have their back. And then finally, a full, unreserved commitment to the local church. That's what you owe them. That's your first priority in your ministry life is to them. Not that the church is your first priority above your personal relationship with Christ and your family, but that in your ministry life, that you're most invested right there. Let me just check something real quick. Yeah. All right, let me just give you one little PS to this, and we'll leave preachers and elders. There will be no problems between preachers and elders when those things are done. If the golden rule is followed, if there is free communication, there's mutual love and trust, if they can agreeably disagree, and if they're understanding.
Was the last part of that?
The number 5?
Understanding, is that what you said?
Yeah, each possesses an understanding heart. And again, it's right there on the PowerPoint.
Oh,
It's a multitasking day. Sorry about that.
it's too hard for me, man. It's snowing outside, you see?
I did.
I tend to shut down when it snows.
And we got a little late start with that anyway. Now, go ahead and take the time to finish that up. We're fixing to change gears completely. We're done with elders and preachers. And certainly there's some principles that apply. Obviously, authority is different when there's a men's business meeting as opposed to an eldership. But the ideal is to try to develop leadership if there are not elders where you are, and have elders, because that's God's plan. You know, we have different terms for that. It's possible to be unscripturally organized, and that is if the preacher's the pastor, for example. And it's possible to be scripturally organized. That is, if the church has elders and deacons, as 1 Timothy 3 outlines. But it's also possible to be scripturally unorganized, right? That is, when you don't have elders and deacons. And you know, if Paul told Titus to appoint elders in those congregations on the island of Crete, that meant that there were congregations existing that did not have elders. And so certainly, you're going to encounter leadership is the dearth of our time. It's one of our biggest challenges in the church or in the world, for that matter. And so you're going to find yourself in situations where you don't have elders, but you're always working toward that end. All right, let's move on to conducting weddings, unless you have any questions about this unit. All right. With regard to conducting weddings, let me suggest that, by way of introduction, there are going to be some occasions when you're going to be called and asked to do a wedding by somebody that you don't know. How do you handle that? How would you handle that? What does that even imply? Not always, but usually.
So it's conduct the wedding for someone that you don't know. There's a possibility that counsel them in the first place.
Okay, so you're going to tell them that counseling is going to be a requirement because you don't even know who they are. You can't just join two people together. All right, so you're going to talk to them about the necessity of counseling. What else? Let me tell you guys, this part's not easy. You got one thing that you have to deal with is, do they have a right to even be married? And if not, you're not a police officer, you're not a law enforcement officer, but you are in a position to say, I'm not able to do this. You're going to be very kind. You're going to be loving, but you're going to say, I'm sorry. I'm not going to be able to do that. Well, why not? And then you just tell them as gently as you can. And I can't promise you what kind of reaction you get. Either the phone will hang up, or some more discussion, or an okay, thank you, or maybe have somebody to curse at you before they hang up. But these are things that you got to ascertain in regards to somebody who calls you out of the blue, and it happens. I've had it happen several times. Yes, sir.
For a wedding, or is it legally said that they advertise it in the newspaper and on their local radio stations?
To advertise weddings?
Yeah.
Yes. I don't know that I get the newspaper here, but I don't know that I see wedding announcements, especially in the South. In the Sunday paper, there'll be a whole section sometimes, especially in the summertime, of weddings. And I think in smaller towns, there's more of that. So yes, they do. And where they're doing the radio, I have been places where I hear them saying that, and that's typically in a more rural setting. But that's certainly, I guess, could factor in here. People are going to know that you're doing that.
Because in the law, it has to be announced at least 3 weeks before the wedding.
Okay.
So they have to do that.
Where you're from?
In the Caribbean, most of the islands.
And it's interesting then that you don't have to have a lot of your ducks in a row by the time 3 weeks,
Yeah.
by 21 days before the wedding. You need to have all that counseling done, because if it's announced and it's going forward, you got to make sure that they know everything you want them to know, and you're prepared, and there's no surprises. So that's a good consideration to make. So we're going to talk about, with both weddings and funerals, there are local customs that you need to be familiar with and to be in compliance with.
Well, Neal, is that a red flag if you get called by somebody you don't know?
It can be, and that's a good point.
I've never been on this side of the pulpit, and if I'm sitting in a place and I get a phone call from two people, like you say, that you do not know, then I would think, well, there's something must be wrong. Why are they calling me?
Okay.
That would be me, though.
That's a good question, and here's a possible answer. They don't have a religious affiliation.
Yeah.
But there's something driving them. Maybe it's a family member. Maybe it's one of them saying, I want God involved in this. You know, this is serious business. And so they'll call you.
They may want God involved, but what if neither one of them are members of the church?
Well, and that's what we were talking about before. And that may be something that's worth discussing. You have to have in your mind what your policy is with regard to that. Mm. Will you marry two non-Christians? Will you marry a Christian to a non-Christian? Will you only marry Christians? Mm. See, for example, and I don't fault him at all, that's Garrett's position. That was our first intern here. He would not marry. He had an opportunity to marry two non-Christians. And I was out of town. I wasn't able to do that. And he was very kind, handled it just right, didn't offend them at all. I'm not sure how much detail he went into, but it was his policy not to do that. And we discussed that. I don't know if it's still his policy. He may have changed it. But that's his prerogative. I think I explained my position on that. That it said they're going to go, so if they have a right in God's eyes to be married, and I sit down with them and they seem to have a reasonable commitment to one another, and that they're not entering into this rashly, but they seem to have thought it through, and there's some maturity there and some hope for that to continue, then I will do that, especially if I have an opportunity to evangelize and to convert them. And one of the first weddings I ever did converted the man and the wife. The woman before and the man after. Now, they had a great marriage for several years. I just found out a few years ago they divorced because of his infidelity. That happens in the church all the time, too. That had nothing to do with their being non-Christians. And that's the sad thing, you talk to just about any preacher, would you rather do a wedding or a funeral?
Wedding.
Funeral. Man, for two reasons. Number one is that there's more eyes on you at a wedding than there is at a funeral. And there's a lot more pressure that goes along with that. But number two, if they're dead, they stay dead. But if they're married, they don't always stay married. And that's a very sad thing. I've seen it with those who both grew up in the church. I've seen it with those who didn't and who were converted. I've seen it with non-Christians where they didn't stay together. But it's a symptom of our society. We can equip them the best we can, but we cannot do anything to tie the knot so that they can't untie it. That's between them and the Lord and them and each other. And so that's a frustrating part of that. But I have, it's just been my position, and you are free to take whatever position you want to on that for your personal conscience. If you don't feel like it's right to do that, then don't do that.
And then I may get somebody like you did, that first couple, and judge that, hey, I can marry them even though they're non-Christians. And then I marry them, but I could catch a lot of flack from members of the church. 4 or 5 people coming up and saying, I can't believe you did that.
That's right. That's something you have to factor in. And that may be a situation where you feel no problem with it at all, but it's going to be divisive to your local work. Let's talk about like the scripture of divorced and remarried man. If there had been significant problem in the congregation, were we going to force those men down their throats? And now it's no longer a 1 Timothy chapter 3 thing. It's an Ephesians 4 or 1 Corinthians 1 kind of a thing. It'd be divisive. We don't want to be divisive in any situation. So you might find yourself in a local work where the membership would be up in arms. So that's something I would want to know from the elders. If I get a call and I'm not sure how the congregation feels, or a men's meeting, if you don't have elders, say, all right, here's 2 non-Christians that would like me to perform their wedding ceremony. How do you all feel about that? Because then you get a gauge for what kind of reaction. Because you don't want to do something that may not be wrong biblically, but that could be practically problematic for you. So that's a good point. All right, somebody calls you don't know. What else do you do? Anything else?
Meet with them.
Okay.
See them.
All right, you want to meet with them, obviously, before you go any further. That's a given. But in that interview, you begin to find out some things about them. How serious are they? Is this rash? How long have you known each other? These are just things in the small talk of it all to try to ascertain that. Here's what you may find. What if you work in a local work where the elders or the men say, we don't want any instruments used in the wedding, in the building. We have a policy that we don't want that to be done in our church building because we want to confuse people or whatever. All right? You've got to convey that to that couple. All right, so that's going to happen from time to time. It's happened to me several times. One of those weddings I gave you an outline for was of a couple that called me out of the blue. Yes?
It happens a lot in the Caribbean because of being a tourism destination. The person does show up when they get married. But it's a very difficult thing for a preacher to do, especially in my case, being a licensed marriage officer in the British Virgin Islands, the registry would often send persons to you because they have to get the license from them and then they come to you, or they would send them to you that way. It's your choice. It's always your choice whether to do it or not. They don't force you to do it. It's your choice.
Well, and I think that puts you, even if they force you to do it, again, it's an Acts 5:29 matter. We ought to obey God rather than men.
Yeah.
If they're trying to coerce you to do something that you're not allowed in God's eyes to do, you can't do that. But in a case where it's your choice, it may mean financially a boon, a help for you. But that's not the basis for the decision. Is it right? Can I do it? All right, but let's talk about, spend the most of our time talking about ordinary standard weddings. Assuming that they have a right to be married, you're willing to marry them. All right, what happens? Again, the first thing you do is you touch base. Talk about the date of the wedding, the place of the wedding. Go ahead and write down some things like what time. Is it an afternoon? Is it a morning? Is it a nighttime wedding? What size is this? Is this going to be a big wedding? Is there going to be a wedding party? Is it going to be me, you, mom and dad, and a few others? You know, what do you conceive of? And sometimes they haven't given a lot of thought to that part of it. Is there going to be a rehearsal? Is there going to be a meal? You know, just make sure that they're thinking through all this. And then in that initial meeting, you go ahead and set up the premarital counseling. All right, well, sounds like it's great. June 15th is a wonderful time to do that. Let's meet next Tuesday, and we'll start meeting, if we can do that, every Tuesday afternoon, 2 o'clock, until we're done with the premarital counseling. Is that a good time with your work schedule and so forth? And then work out whatever is. All right? And then after you touch base, the next thing that you do is, and you go through all of that, the premarital counseling, I've already given you all of that, then we get to the time of the rehearsal dinner, or the rehearsal. What I want to know at that time is who is going to be in charge of the rehearsal. Do you have a wedding coordinator? And I'll tell you what, I like for there to be one. I'd rather somebody else go through all that. I mean, you think about it, guys, you want us to be putting tape on the floor and telling everybody to stand here and come in on this song. That's really not, I mean, you will find yourself in situations where you've had to do that. And be the one to arrange for somebody to do music, however that's done. But I like for there to be somebody who will just, and see if you can't find a family member or somebody who can just be the point person. It's usually a woman, to say, all right, go in on this song, you know, walk this way, slow down, too fast, too slow. It's better to have somebody else doing that, because if they expected me, it's going to be real funny looking when we get to it. But, you know, after a while, it's not something you brag about, but you learn after you've done a few weddings, you know if that coordinator doesn't even have any idea what she's doing or not. And you can help her out gently without embarrassing her. All right, remember that people can be silly during rehearsal, so don't lose your patience. It's a tense time. There are conflicting ideas within the wedding party. Boy, just watch the bride and her mama. That's where it can happen a lot of times.
Drama.
Or a very, lots of drama. It could be a very vocal person in the party, including the matron or maid of honor, man, or a best man, you know. There's always somebody that was asked to be included in the wedding party that's not responsible and is not, you know, he doesn't show up for the rehearsal, and you don't know at the last minute whether it's usually he is going to be there or not.
I think flashbacks here.
Yes. I'm describing a lot of our weddings. All right, get the songs in order. That's very important by the time of the rehearsal. So that doesn't mean you do it, but you say, hey, who's in charge of your music? Make sure that they know what songs, what songs do you, and sometimes I say, what do you suggest? And, that's not really hard. You can find some resources for that. All right, and then the rehearsal, you're dealing with the people part. And, customs change. All of this is subject to the customs where you are. But a lot of times after that preliminary music to seat everybody, the first song will be the seating of the grandparents. And then the second song will be the seating of the parents. You have wedding parties, right? Typically, you're going to be there with the best man and the groom in some holding area. So after the grandparents and the parents come out, the preacher is the first one out. And these are things that you can help people with in case they don't know. A lot of times you'll be surprised. They've been to a lot of weddings, but they don't think about the technical details. And usually, after the preacher comes the groom, after the groom comes the best man, and then you stand on your marks. And then the attendants come in.
I know, sir. Yep. Go over that list again. I try to understand. When they come in, like the church building is going to be empty?
Yeah, and again, no. After all the guests are seated,
Okay.
anybody that's attached to the wedding in any way,
Okay.
family and attendants.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
So, and again, this is subject, I've done weddings in several states, and customs are varied. Same thing with funerals. And one thing is happening with both of those events is they're changing as our culture changes. And so you just never know what's going to be in a wedding. So these are kind of templates. They don't necessarily hold true all the time. But you'll typically have the grandparents come in and be seated. And maybe during the same song or another song, but then you have the parents seated. And after that's done, then the preacher and that little party comes out, the groom and the best man. They take their marks. And then the attendants, the bridesmaids and the groomsmen come in. Now, I don't even know how much does that even correlate. Y'all do it that way in the Caribbean. I know that like in the Cambodian wedding, if you've seen, I don't even have any way to fathom how that's done.
Seems like the line there should actually be, what are the specific ways people will enter? Because I'm
right.
hoping when our daughters are married, I heard the saying, it was a Spanish thing down in Texas or something, and the dad was in the back, and he hollered out to the groom, come and get your bride.
Yeah, I've seen that before.
I love it.
Yeah.
That's my daughter. Now you come down here and get her.
Yeah.
Oh, it's awesome.
Yeah, and so, and you might even suggest that. And there'll be certain things, I don't know if any of you guys went to Alex and Lindsay's wedding. Did any of you guys go to that?
Couldn't go.
I never have seen it done this way, where the preacher stood, and I'm probably going to do this from now on. I like this, because normally what I've done is I've gone up to the top, and you have the bride and groom right here, and you're facing them, and then everybody's looking up there. What Bob did is he went down, he had never done this before. It just kind of struck him. Or he saw somebody else do it. He went down, and he stood on the bottom, and he had the bride and groom up there. They're facing the audience. He's preaching this way. Now, that makes a wedding not so bad to do, because you're not having to stand in front of everybody. You're not on display.
Talking to people.
Yeah, exactly. So who's everybody looking at? Bride and groom. And so that kind of puts the focus on them. I think that's brilliant. I don't know why you haven't done that before. So that might be the way to do it, guys. I'll tell you.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Focus on them, man.
Because it ain't about me. Not that they're looking at you anyway, but anything we can do to really put the
They're paying
focus on
attention
them.
to you.
Yeah. They are.
Listen to every word you say.
There's no pressure there, but yeah, that's what's happening.
I did so in my brother's wedding, just part of it.
Well, it's a weighty thing anyway. So anyway, but what Brad says is good. There are going to be certain things that they may want to incorporate or that you might suggest. Now, you might suggest it and they say, no, I'm not comfortable with that. Well, that's fine. It's their wedding. But it's a great idea. Maybe they hadn't thought of it. Assuming all these things happen, then you come down to the wedding march beginning. And these are just general ideas. It can certainly be different. You have the ring bearer come in, the flower girl, and that's sometimes a fiasco, but that's all right. It's a memory that they're going to have of their wedding. Then the bridesmaids coming in, usually with the groomsmen, maid of honor, and then the bride on the arm of her father, if it's done that way. And then you instruct them. That's always important. All the way through. You're telling people what comes next and what, we're gathered here today. We give this woman. You're always guiding them through the ceremony. That just makes them at ease because you're going to be nervous. I tell you, if I ever write a book on preaching, I'm going to have a chapter on weddings and just grooms. We had a guy that was a soccer star at University of Richmond. He was a cool customer. I mean, he was always cool. we decided to get married in what they call Cannon Chapel at the University of Richmond. In July, it was a building that was built in the early 1700s. It was hot in that place. And so we're sitting there, and he's joking the whole time. And then it's time for us to go out. And then the nerves hit him. And we're standing there, there's like 57,000 steps, about halfway up. And he's standing there facing, they decided she'd be right here next to me, and he's right there. And he starts to sweat. And one big drop of sweat stops on his nose. And he's there the whole time, and he's just all shaking. So I tell him, be relaxed, be cool. But those guys can be the most nervous ones.
Remind everyone, don't lock your knees. Jiggle around if you got to. It's better than passing out.
That's right. So that's a good point. I forgot to mention that. 2 times you mentioned that. Mention it at the rehearsal for everybody. But the guy, and talk to the bride and groom about it, because the most likely to do that are any man and the bride. So you make sure you tell her. I don't know that I've ever seen a bridesmaid, but you still want to say that at the rehearsal, because they might be, some people do different things when they're nervous. Some folks lock their knees. But I always tell the best man and the groom, remember, keep your knees loose. Keep them bent a little bit. You don't want to lock them. And just put that thought in their mind so that it decreases. I've never lost one yet, but because of that, that's a good point.
Never lost one.
But I'm not done, so it can happen.
Keep talking. I don't even want to do a wedding.
They're easy, really. They aren't all that difficult. They're just different beasts. Then seating, it's complicated these days because of the things we've talked about. There's going to be more than one set a lot of time. But your grandparents and whatever combinations of grandparents. The typical rule has been that when parents come in, the grooms, folks come in first, the grooms, grandparents, because you're letting the last ones that come in is kind of an honor position. Weddings are all about the women, about the bride. So their grandparents come in second. The mother of the bride comes in last, and then they're the first to leave. So it works in reverse the same way. You'll notice that I have there always accept pay. Now you think, well, that's not why we're doing this. So why? What? You want them to be invested. Now, what do you do with the money? I've got a couple of suggestions for you. You can pocket it and do what you want to. But why not consider spending it on your bride? What about if they give you, it's not going to be a bunch of money, but let's say they give you $50, $75, $100. There's not many situations where if you have a wife that you give that to her, that she's not going to be thrilled. This is your fun money. This is not, there's no stipulations on it. Buy you a dress, blow it, whatever, it's yours. Well, you just invest in your own marriage, you see. And it's a legitimate, great thing. She makes how many sacrifices for you in the work that you do as a preacher? There's a great way. Here's another thing you can do. Hold on to it. Cash it. Wait 10 years, and then write a letter to them and send it back to them. Because they're probably maybe in a situation where they could use that. Or what a great thought. See? You say, 10 years ago you gave me this as compensation for doing your wedding. I want you to know, in a world of throwaway marriages, I'm so thrilled to see that you guys are coming up on your 10th anniversary. Go out to dinner and enjoy this. Well, it wasn't income anyway, right? It wasn't anything that was in your budget. And so it doesn't hurt you to do that. And what a great way to tell them that marriage has value. You can put a sticker on it. Besides, it might make them think, well, sure, I'm glad I gave him 200 and not 25. Or, we should have given him 200 and not 25.
That's a great idea.
So that's what I used to do is I used to take it. I'd tell them, instead of paying me, just put it in the contribution plate. But what might have happened in a few cases is I got thinking about that. They might not have done that. So I also have taken it and put it in the contribution. Cashed it and then gave it. But I have also kept it. Sometimes it came at a time when I was getting ready to go on a mission trip, and I was short, and that helped to make up the difference in my hotel room or whatever it was. I've given it to my bride more than once, and I've given it to a couple on several occasions.
You can spend it on your missions, doing good deeds.
Well, I write them a note saying, hey, I want to thank you for this because you're helping me to go to Africa, and that's to preach the gospel. So a lot of different things you can do with that, but I say you're helping them to invest. To pay, when you pay for something, it means more to you.
Yeah, that's true. What in the world do you do when they ask you what they should pay you?
Oh, I have a standard response in all that. I say, I know that you'll be fair. And, you know, I say I don't have a set amount, but I'm sure that you'll do what's right. You'll do right. You know, I don't want to try to make them feel guilty, but I'm going to tell them, I'm not doing this for pay. But you know, this is on your integrity. This is on your fairness. So that usually works. I mean, you know, the range is not all that great. I don't know that I've ever been paid more than a couple of $100 for doing a wedding, and that would be even rare, you know. But that's the same as somebody says, hey, what do you charge to come hold a gospel meeting or a seminar? Here's how I have learned through the years, how that works out. Sometimes you get paid a whole lot more than you're worth. Sometimes you get paid a whole lot less. You're going to lose money from time to time. It all balances out. And same with weddings and funerals. Marriage certificate, let me say a little bit about that. Most states, the preacher's the only signature needed. And I always sign, because it'll have these little blanks to fill. I always put my name and then minister or evangelist or preacher.
You have to have some kind of certification.
It depends. Not in Colorado. In Virginia, you had to go before a judge, and you had to be certified and get a letter. A lot of states are that way. I don't know what other states you're familiar with, but Colorado's pretty lax about that.
Seems like under this one you should just find out what the local laws are.
That's it. And you'll find that out. But no matter what state you're in, you have to sign the marriage certificate. If you're the officiant, you have to sign.
Brad, I think you missed a chance to call us hippies.
Oh, a very important thing about the marriage certificate. Never perform a wedding until the license is in hand. And if you can, try not to have it as your responsibility to get it filed with the courthouse. I don't like that pressure. You talk about the pressure standing in front of everybody and preaching the wedding. I don't want to accidentally lose it or forget it or something else happen. All right, I've given you guys some wedding outlines. What I'm going to give you afterwards is I have here is a wedding template. And basically, in the sermon process, we have the introduction, the processional, the giving of the bride, prayer, sermon, the exchange of vows, do you. If there's anything like a unity candle or expression to mothers or songs, you've seen the pouring of the sand in the jar, the taking of the flour to the mother, all those kinds of things. You need to have at least a template in hand to be able to suggest to them, because they'll go, well, we thought about doing this, or maybe they hadn't thought about it. And you go, if you guys, sometimes in weddings they have a unity candle or the pouring of the sand, and they go, oh, I like that. I'd love to put that in the wedding. You see, just kind of helping them think some things they might not have thought of. You're going to have a family member read a scripture or to lead a prayer. Like John Warren's led a prayer at that wedding. That was a great touch. Sometimes you have different folks involved. And then you have the prayer and the pronouncement and the kiss. So you need to have kind of in mind, how's this thing going to flow? And then be able to tell them, to give them assurance. Because they've been to weddings, but they don't know what's going to happen in theirs. They need help and guidance. And so I'll have a copy of that given. Now, I know that was very brief, but how much can you do with a wedding? There's just certain things that you need to be prepared for, and certain procedural things. But are there any other questions you have about weddings and what goes on? All right, we're rocking and rolling. Let's move on to funerals. This one will take some more time. Let me give you some practicals. What do you do when the death notice comes? Somebody gives you a phone call, and they may say, Daddy's was pretty close. I don't think he's going to be with us much longer. And it's midnight. You do not wait till the morning. You get out of bed, you get dressed, you go down there. That is one of the dark moments that people go through. And they should not have to go alone. Now, hopefully, you're in a circumstance where you can also call an elder. What you do is you may know that there's a certain elder that's closer to them. Have that elder there too, if you can. If you can't, don't be sour about it, but go on down there. That is one of the things about what we do, that we do have more flexibility. And if those elders are shepherding men, that family's probably going to call them too. So you ask where the family is at. Are they at home? Are they at the hospital, the nursing home? Find out where they are, and then head down there. So again, this emphasis, make the visit. When you find out, not later, go. All right, so what do you do when you get there? I don't know if I told you about the two little kids from Saguache or that area that they went down in their four-wheelers. Did I tell you about that? There were just two non-Christians. They were playing on the four-wheeler, and one of them died immediately, and the other one was on life support. And we were called up to the hospital there at the university on the east end of town in Aurora. There are many times where there's just not much you can say. That's a tragedy. I told you about the grandfather of the new Christian who took a shotgun, put it in his mouth, and pulled the trigger. When you walk into that room, that's when you remember you got to have a happy place, because this guy it was like a Frankenstein. You had to stitch him back together just to kind of put him together. But I'm not focusing so much on him, because I realize, even though he wasn't successful, that fellow didn't live very long after that because of what he had done to himself. But I'm there for her and her husband. And there's not, what do you say, in that situation? But, we love you and we're here for you. I'm so sorry. I know this hurts. But be natural. That's what's important. Be sincere. Be normal. And I can give you some ideas and some things that you say in a situation like that. You say, I know God's going to bless you. I know it's hard to contemplate this right now. Don't say it's going to be all right, because it may not be all right for a long time. Don't say I understand, even if you had a very similar situation, because that's not what's needed to be heard at that time. God's going to strengthen you. You have some wonderful memories, don't you? He was what kind of man or woman was he or she, if you don't know them very well? Or maybe you can recall some great memory. Don't be overly light, but just try to be personal. After you've done some initial consoling, step out of the flow and find somebody who's close, but somebody who seems to have it together. It might be a sister, it might be a friend or a neighbor. It could be a church member. And then you can ask some pertinent questions. When did he die? Had he had difficulties? This is assuming you don't know this. But the most important thing is to be there. To be of comfort to the family. All right, number 2. With regard to funeral services and arrangements, if you can underline this, never ask, do you want me to preach the funeral? It's just not a very tasteful way to approach it. So let's say you've been there with the family. You're just there, you're visiting with them, you say, I'm sorry. Now they may tell you then, hey, could you do this service? Or could you perform it? What you do is you go back later in the day and you ask, can the church be of any help? If they want your help, they want you to do it, that's when they'll ask. Find out from the funeral home if the family doesn't tell you the arrangements. This has happened to me more than once, that they didn't ask me, and then I called the funeral home and I found out that I was the one that was doing the funeral. That is, I got thinking, what if I hadn't called? I'm going there sitting I'm on row 8, and they're waiting on me to be up front preaching it. Sometimes it's in the newspaper. One time I found out I was doing the funeral through the newspaper. Then it was a situation where I assumed it wasn't going to be me. And I found out it was. But I have found if you'll say, hey, what can we do as a congregation to help you? Can the church be of help at this time? That's when they'll tell you. Because they'll also need song leaders. Sometimes they'll want church members to be pallbearers, those kinds of things. So what do you need to know in conducting the service and assisting the family? Obviously, you need to know the time. It's important to know the place. Again, if you have a policy, and I tell you, I've served in 2 elderships, and both of them have, in the realm of judgment, taken the position of having adopted the policy not to have, for weddings or funerals, instrumental music in the building. And so it matters where it's going to be held, because they might want Willie Nelson played at the funeral. That's not what happened in the church building. So is it going to be the funeral home, another church building, the church building where you are? Why do you know if it's your church building? The ladies want to know in the congregation. Because of meals, they're going to have a meal after the funeral service. Are we double booked? Is there something else going on? Sometimes it's held outside. Sometimes it's a graveside service only. So you want to know where it's going to be held. Typically, it's going to be somewhere inside, either a church building or a funeral home, and then it's going to be at the graveside. You'll do both, or sometimes you split that with somebody else. All right, then you want to know special wishes about the service. About the singing, have you worked it out yet? More often than not, they haven't. So you'll sit there and, if they want church hymns, if they want congregational singing, you help them through, what were some of her favorite songs? Are there any songs that she requested? Sometimes it's easy. Sometimes the deceased will have planned out their funeral in advance. And then the family will come in and say, this is what Mama wanted. And then they'll hand it to you. So a lot of times they're in grief, even if it's prepared, if it's a tragedy. And so they haven't thought about songs. Last thing on their mind. So you're gently there at helping them to think about the things that they're going to care about when they look back on it. Is there something particular that you want to notice about the deceased or to point out about the deceased? All right, so here's what's going to happen. Let's say that the person dies on Wednesday morning. You're going to arrange to meet with the family. Say it's a Saturday funeral. So you're going to say, can we meet tomorrow morning, Thursday morning, and talk about the details of the service? Oh, sure. Well, I'm going to bring up a book and here's some pictures and things, And so you meet with them and you talk about the deceased. I always want to do that. I want to say, what are some things that we really want to highlight about their life at the funeral? But what are some things that I might not know about them? Let's say you haven't been there very long, say you don't know them very well. I always take notes every time when I meet with the family. Dad was such a hard worker, worked at the steel plant for 45 years, was very active in the Rotary Club. I want to know all that.
Special memories, all that stuff. Special memories, all that stuff.
Yeah, and so you're going to deal with characteristics. Oh, he always liked to joke. He was such a prankster, maybe they'll mention some examples. If the family's not getting up and sharing those, it depends, some families are too emotional. Then you want to be able to have that information to be able to share. Makes it more personal. That's the preamble. That's not the sermon itself, but it makes it more personable. Whether they're a Christian or not, it doesn't matter. Those are important things to mention. Pallbearers, are they selected? Are there going to be honorary pallbearers? A lot of things factor into that. The age of the deceased, maybe all the folks that they have to call on as pallbearers are because they're being chosen because they're strong enough to do it. They may want honorary peers, brothers and sisters, brothers or co-workers that are too old and feeble to hold the casket, so those kinds of things. Where will the burial be? You know, those are just things that you find out.
Look, you mentioned if they're strong enough to carry it. Man, I had one bad experience with that.
But did they drop the casket?
Almost.
Oh.
Because the way they had the church building, for some reason they couldn't fit it in the elevator, so they had to walk up a step with it.
Man, Bear's nightmare.
On that day, I realized how heavy that person could be.
Oh, yeah, well, and the casket itself may weigh a couple 100 pounds or more. Depending on what kind it is, much
I
more.
was red, something, I can't remember the wood, but that thing was heavy.
Oh.
And the persons who were at the front, two elderly men, and the weight of the casket was pulling them back down. So the persons below, including me, having the sweating to push that thing up.
That's not like a way that you'll look back on those with fond memories if that's been botched. That leaves scars. Seriously, that's not good.
Because the last thing you want is for that casket to fall.
That's right. That's
And
right.
then lose a couple of guys like
Yes.
forever.
2 follow-up funerals. Not good.
Body comes out or something.
Man.
But see, you never know. I mean, you
Crazy.
can't make this stuff up. It happens.
Can't write it that good, huh?
You can't write it yet. Let's see. There will be those that maybe at times that want to be of assistance, that want to be involved in the service. Or you may ask, is there others that you want to be involved in the service? You may have somebody who reads the obituary. Maybe somebody else in the congregation, another preacher from another congregation. Somebody that wants to read scripture, lead a prayer. So you want them to think through what the service is going to look like. All right. I'm going to stop here. The bell's going to ring here any second now. When we come back, we'll talk about the service itself and what it should look like.
The thing is this can happen in the middle or the tail end of the week, and all this is going to fit in with your sermon preparation.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You may even have a Sunday a funeral. So you may have 2 sermons in Bible class that day and the funeral in between. You know, that's not typical, but it can happen. I've had 3 deaths in a week and 2 funerals. I've never had 3 funerals in a week, but I know Ronnie Hayes. We were at Bible camp one year, and he had to leave camp. He was the director of camp. He had to leave camp 3 times to go and conduct funerals back home. So talk about, and especially if it's same people going to those different funerals. That's 3 different funeral sermons you got to come up with. So but that's exceptional. That's not the ordinary. So, but you're right. These are all things that go on in the middle of, people die at inconvenient times. It's not going to happen. It usually will happen when you're busy. You're trying to juggle 10 things, I think this is the first class of doing preacher's work where I didn't have at least 1 funeral to do, which is pretty. All right. We're talking about funerals. Oh, I forgot to say that. That lesson by Melvin Ote was incredible. Man, I'm fired up. That was good stuff. That's preaching. That's what I want to do when I grow up.
He was a student. He was a student here.
He's in the master's program.
I mean, he was never a student here.
I don't know if he did.
You sound like Memphis.
I'm not sure. I don't think he went anywhere. I think he just got a law degree and moved to Washington, D.C. and started helping with the congregation. He's a phenomenal guy. Good man. All right, we're talking about assisting. I think we've done that. So now we're to the funeral itself, the service itself. It's always a good idea, right before the service starts, to meet with the family. A lot of times the funeral home will have them sequestered. And so if you can meet with them and offer to pray with them, that's very helpful. It gives you a good way to figure out what kind of personalities you have. Sometimes, and it depends on, you probably will not be in a homogenous situation where you always preach to the same kind of people all the time. I've been in multi-ethnic, multicultural situations, and people deal with grief different ways. Different parts of the country do. So different families are more emotional. And if I'm in there with them and I hear there's, a lady who just can't get herself under control, I learn that right there, and I'll know what I can maybe do to help with that later on. So, but it's also in its most basic level, you're helping them to try to have some peace in the moment. They may not have peace in the situation, depending on the status of the person that's passed away. But it's good. It's a good calming thing to do. Number two. Well, actually, under that, if possible, meet the requests of the family. And again, funerals are getting so individual. They may, want his cowboy hat, up on the podium with you while you preach. That's fine. What's wrong with that? They may want to hear Willie Nelson. As long as it's a good song, that's fine. It's not a worship service. A wedding and a funeral is not. That's my view of the matter. And so, as long as it's not crossing the bounds of morality, then that's certainly okay. Number two, do not give the family false hope. So what do you do if the deceased is an erring Christian or a non-Christian? What do you do in that circumstance? I'll tell you what I've heard. We studied we had a group Bible study going up north here. And it was a relative of one of the members. We were up there and we were trying to really hit the necessity of baptism and the oneness of the church. He embraced everything else, but those two concepts. He died, and before we were able to convert him. One of the men that was called in from another congregation was actually, I think he was an elder in another congregation. He was asked to preach the funeral. He got up there and he said, "We know so-and-so is in heaven." And we had 10 or 11 other people in that study. Slam the door. Now, we think now the door may be opening up again. Slam the door. You don't give false hope. If they have not obeyed, our job is not to preach anybody into heaven or into hell. They have lived their life in that way. We're there for the people who are living and remaining. And so if a person is not right in the state in which they die, preach the obituary. He was a son. He was a father. He was a husband, a brother, a co-worker. Then you sing. Congregational singing is good, or you have whatever arrangements made there. And then you preach to the audience. You comfort them without compromising truth. Because there's comfort for anybody from God's Word. God has a plan. I mean, in the midst of that, you're going to say life is brief. Preparation is necessary. If the deceased were here right now, he would want me to tell you of the importance, because that's true. Think about the rich man in Luke 16. He wanted the message preached. And so, but we're not going to be mean and disrespectful. We're going to use a gentle and mellow tone of voice. Somebody said, this is the fire and brimstone opportunity that only one I have. Well, it might be the only time they'll even be receptive to truth. So we're going to be very wise in how we handle that situation. What if you have to work with a denominational preacher? Don't call him brother.
Right?
He's Mr.
Mister?
Yeah. Is he your brother?
No.
So, that may be what, and he's not your pastor, he's not your reverend. Be very, don't, you can do things, the same thing two different ways. You call him old Mr. Jones, well, be very kind and respectful, but he's not brother Jones.
Yeah, because that leaves what you're trying to
We're in
present
fellowship.
in a bad light if you're mean to him.
That's exactly right. So we're going to be kind, but we're not going to satisfy something that we're not allowed to do.
Right.
If you can help it, if it's in your power, don't ask him to preach or to pray. I mean, it may be out of your control. Remember, it's not a worship service, but if you can help it, you can give him the obituary. Yeah. Now, it's not the end of the world if he has to do that, but if it's in your power.
You never know what they're going to put in there. If they're gonna pray, you don't never know what people are gonna say in their prayers.
That's right. And I even have it in my notes, you know, if you can, avoid having them do that. Yes, sir.
Why would you ever, if you're, I don't know, being asked to do the funeral, why would a denominational preacher even be there?
Well, what you're going to have in situations, you're going to have divided family. And so some of the family members are going to feel very strongly, I want my preacher involved in this. And that, you know, depending on the family dynamic, it can be contentious. And so you may be thrown in a situation where you have to do it with somebody. I have had to be in that situation before. I have been asked by family to have a part in a funeral that was being conducted by a denominational preacher. And so sometimes you're thrown into those kind of situations. And so it will happen. I predict every one of you guys are going to be in that situation at some point. So you have to give it some forethought. Now, sometimes it's not going to be within your power. You might say, I'm not going to conduct this funeral if I have to do it in those circumstances. Some of you got to figure, I've never been placed into a situation that, except for one that I had to participate in where he was doing it, where I've had to deal with that. So, there's just some things to think about. Where do you stand? Things are changing. I don't know. It used to be we were told after the service, after you preach, you stand at the head of the casket. Sometimes you may be there for a long time. Sometimes you go and you stand at the head of the casket. Everybody's processed by the family. The idea about that is you're leading that body. It's just a tradition. You're leading that body out to the cemetery, and you stay with the body. Now you may find out. I'd ask the funeral home when I get there, what's y'all's custom? Because you have 8 funeral homes in town, there may be 8 different customs. They may trademark their procedures, and so but typically, if you act, it's not when you go to the hospital, if you act like you know what you're doing and that you're supposed to be there, the people will just let you do what you do. So nobody's going to look at you funny if you go and stand at the head of the casket and lead it out. That's kind of, I've lived in 3 different parts of the country and done funerals. That's kind of a standard thing that you can do. But talk to the funeral home. Say, do you prefer me to stand by the head of the casket? You may go, well, I ain't never heard of that before. Okay, well, what do you want me to do? Okay. When you get to the burial, if you're going to do the graveside, again, this is kind of customary. It's you walk in front of the body, the casket, not behind it.
You know, talk about what we say
At the graveside? Yeah, here in just a moment.
All right.
All right, so what do you do if the family gets out of control? You have somebody's inconsolable, they're wailing, and just in their emotion.
What can you do?
Well, now I've been there too. What you have to do is, if it gets bad enough, is that you, it depends on when it happens. Let's say it's happening, they come in. Sometimes it's coming in and they're wailing. You just go up to them and you just, it's kind of like, you guys have a law enforcement background, level 1 force. Sometimes the preacher just goes and stands near them. That's going to calm them down. That's going to kind of get things under control. But you want to say something like, God will strengthen you. He certainly was a good man. Let's make sure we can honor him today. Let's if we can, let's try to get composed. Take a moment. Well, you take your time. Get things under control. Say, be soothing. But let them know that that they're not under control. They may have to stop a ceremony. I've not ever had to stop a ceremony before, but I've been there when they did. I saw a preacher come down and just say, "Oh, it's okay. I know this is hard, but let's get through this together."
Because that was my aunt, my cousin died, and he had to stop 3 or 4 times to go.
Yeah.
Because she was, nobody can understand.
You can't proceed if somebody's out of control.
Yeah, I just wondered, what can you do? Because he did his best he could, but it really wasn't.
Sometimes the family don't know what to do. It's a strong personality.
Well, everybody tried. So that's what I was saying. Sometimes it's, I don't know. Yeah, she's a strong personality.
Well, here's what I had in my notes here. One time I had a lady come up to the casket, and this was laid on the casket, and this was wailing. And then what you do is you have to stop the ceremony and just go over and say, may I assist you back to the family? Let me help you to your seat. You know, give them, you don't just immediately do that. Hey guys, it's not going to happen every
No,
It doesn't
no.
happen. What are you
Yeah.
going to do when you get there? You do want to kind of know what to do in
Sure.
that situation.
That's why I'm asking you. He didn't, I don't think he had a clue. He just kept going down there. He was just waiting her out, really.
But you can't, but see what happens, is you got to do a little bit more in control than that, or they're going to take control of that situation. At some point you say, you know, it really would be appropriate for me now to go and be seated.
Well,
We really want to keep this service about that person.
I love them.
It's kind of like you do with any situation that where there's issues, is you just increase the amount of forcefulness until that is handled, so that you don't have to deal with that throughout the whole service. Yes, sir.
And I was thinking the balance, remembering, how do I say this, in light of what we've said, because it's all true, but it's also about the family and them being able to remember.
That's right.
And that may be, for the moment, their coping mechanism. Just let it all out. But we need to keep things wrangled up, as you have said, but still being sensitive to the pain that they're in right then.
That's right. Because we don't want to assume that things are not genuine. You're around people enough, you may know the situation enough to know that person's a DQ and is milking this for all it's worth.
Right.
You know,
That's good.
you have to understand the circumstance. But it could be somebody genuinely in pain. And what you're balancing in that moment, what Brad's saying is right. You're balancing their need to express their grief versus, are they taking the rest of the family hostage and the rest of the people present there, forcing them to be subjected to a prolonged, endless display of what they're doing. So there's a balance there, and your role is to try to facilitate that dynamic, that situation, and to allow them to grieve. And it's the difference between 30 seconds and 3 minutes. You know, is there some point where you go, I've got to act? Because you know what happens in a church service situation? Anytime like that, people are sitting there going, I don't know, what's next? I mean, in a lot of different group dynamic settings, I've seen it where people are hogtied. It's the deer in the headlight look, and they have no idea. Somebody's got to step forward and to do something. And it's, and Brad's right, use wisdom. When? How? You know, so at some point, and in some way, I've got to intervene, but I've got to figure out, I'm analyzing that situation, right? You have to come to
Yeah, I said, what do you do then in a situation where somebody becomes aggressive or physical with the body? Well, I've seen a guy actually slapped.
the corpse.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I mean,
But nobody ever put the problem.
so I mean, there's no concern over it.
Yeah, he's
But, you know, that's where I think you ask others to help you get involved. Somebody who maybe, you have to size up folks very quickly. He respects somebody in that room, hopefully.
Yeah.
And you call them to bear, and you let them run interference. There you're blocking back, and you're in behind them. So that's what you do there. Brad, you have another?
Yeah, and that's a perfect lead-in. This is a moment when a person they're as raw as an exposed tooth. And I'm just thinking, you know, there was my mom crying during my dad's funeral, and if someone had, I know we're on tape with this, I know if someone had thought, well, she's got a little too much. She wasn't. But if someone had thought that, my sister probably would have punched them. If they came down there and were, okay, now calm down. My sister was at that just raw nerve to protect her mother. So all these dynamics are going to be playing out. And you're just like, oh, I don't know.
Remember that if you are who you need to be personally, you're praying, you're asking for guidance and wisdom, and that really helps. I was going to tell you, this has nothing to do with that, but it was very similar. It wasn't at that point. I was about, and I don't know if I told you this or not, about the guy that told me to say his dad's funeral. The guy that had been withdrawn from. Did I tell you all that? Where did I tell it? Okay, well, all right, well, I was asked to do a funeral. We was withdrawn from the young man. It was his grandfather. All right, so the man that died had 3 children, 2 brothers and 2 sons and a daughter. All right, well, the one son whose son we had withdrawn from is the only church connection they had. So they asked, would you do the funeral? You know, I didn't see any violation of what we had done, so sure. All right, so I'm getting ready to preach his funeral. I'm sitting in one of those little side rooms. Well, the man who asked me to preach the funeral, his brother, one of the 2 sons, big, huge, burly construction guy, came in there and he said, I've been talking with my sister. She's a lay Pentecostal preacher. And she said that 2 years ago when he had open heart surgery that she was able to finally get him to say the sinner's prayer. And I want you to say that during the service.
Oh. Wow.
I can't do that. You know, I say, well, I appreciate you telling me that. Doesn't do, because I didn't know that. And so I pray, and I get up there, and I preach my sermon verbatim as I prepared. I'm standing by the casket, coming out. Everybody's getting ready to leave, get in their cars, go to the graveside. And Burley comes up and he says, you didn't say what my sister said to say. I want you to say it at the graveside. I mean, do it just like that. I mean, just pipes on her heart. So I prayed the whole way to the graveside. I happened to have our other preacher with us, and I told him what was going on. And I said, I can't do that. That's not right. And so I get out there to the graveside, and I say, I'm so thankful that I cannot preach anybody into heaven or hell. And I'm so grateful that we could not have a more fair judge than Jesus. No one could be more merciful, nobody more knowledgeable than him. So let's listen to some of his words. So I read, I can't remember where it was. That was it. And I did my remarks as prepared. So yeah, I was prepared after that prayer to get myself as braced as I could for a punch. He came up to me, actually shook my hand, gave me $50. And said, thank you, preacher, and he took off. But you don't know how it's going to work out. You pray, you prepare, but you got to do what's right. God's going to take care of you. I mean, he took care of Stephen too, and that didn't work out so well for him physically, but you got to do what's right. But Brad's correct in that you need to analyze the situation and realize how raw a funeral is. That's a different beast than a wedding. People show their emotions differently in that. But this is, I'm not going to see this person anymore. And family dynamics are very unique. And so you and the Lord are there doing that funeral. And take comfort in that fact.
Yeah, in the end, it was the uncle. He asked my oldest uncle, 3 or 4 of them just hurried back. See, because that was the only people she would go with.
That's the best arrangement.
It was not.
What you have to figure out is what is my relationship with this person. And there are times where you have a relationship with somebody that you can tell them where the bear went through the buckwheat, but sometimes you can't. So you got to leave that with them to figure out what happens in that situation. Yes, sir. Do
you find for funerals of faithful Christians that emotions are less crazy, I guess?
By and large, again, it depends on the family culture, and it depends on the ethnic culture. I preached for a congregation that was very racially diverse in Virginia. And this is not a racial statement, but each ethnicity had peculiar customs and ways of dealing with it. And among our African Americans there, depending on what their background was, it was very much more demonstrative. Yeah. But there's no, well, I have to tell you, and it depends even within that. Our other preacher had open heart surgery, just, quadruple bypass.
Wow.
And we had to drive about an hour and a half down to a funeral. One of our wonderful members, it was her mother or father, I can't remember. Now, she was very quiet, very formal. But the family was of mixed religion. All right, so it wasn't necessarily even ethnicity. It was that 2 denominations had control of this funeral. And so it's a custom, I don't know if it's that way here, but it was in Virginia, that if they found out when we came to the door we were preachers, there was a huge stage up front. And so we got to go up and sit up front with everybody else. And there's probably 10, 12 preachers up there, you know. And this is an old, rickety church building in the middle of nowhere, Virginia. And so we're up there on that stage, and we noticed after we sat down, I was on one end, poor Bill was way on the other side. So I couldn't even say, are you okay? You know? But I noticed there was a band warming up down here, right behind me. And they got the spirit during that, they thought, during that funeral. And I thought, the whole stage was shaking. I thought it was going to come through. And I was watching Bill make sure he wasn't having a heart attack over there.
Yeah.
He had been to a lot of these kind of situations. But she was mortified. And the Baptists in her family, now she was a member of the church, but the Baptists in her family were mortified. But the Pentecostals, this was their deal.
Yeah.
So she was faithful. Now the father wasn't. But she was a wonderful, faithful Christian. But another time when the deceased and the person was faithful, he died suddenly. He was her world, and she was distraught. I wasn't actually doing that funeral, but she was out of control. I hate to say it that way, but she was nearly out of control. But by and large, I think you're right. But it's not necessarily the fear that they're lost, and the emotion doesn't come from that. It's just people's views of death and the family member themselves. So.
Oh yeah, for my aunt, it was her only son, and he was only 13. So she felt like she was part of the reason he died. So it was
you have guilt. So there's all kind of underlying factors that may not have anything to do with the status spiritually of that person.
These things went off.
They went off, of course. Just now, or?
Yep.
Okay. Well, we got this figured out. I don't know how we prevent it, but it's about this time every class period.
I think Charles has a remote back there. I'm sure he gets a good laugh at it.
Hey, there we go. All right.
That's hilarious.
Hey, if he can do that, that's pretty props. That's pretty good. He revived 2 of them this morning. What's the order of the service? Let's just talk a little bit about that. I don't know if I have it on another. No. This is very varied, but something like, a couple of songs, maybe have a welcome, a couple of songs, an obituary, a prayer, and a scripture. Song, a message, and a prayer. It's not very complicated. Sometimes people are going to want to have a place carved out for the family to speak. And you've all been to funerals like that where people have prepared or unprepared statements. Obviously, certainly don't forbid them, but I would suggest that you give some thought to whether or not you encourage them. It's potluck. It can be very tastefully done, concisely done, or it can be a can of worms. You could get in, you could create problems. And every Tom, Dick, and Harry gets up there and
they say crazy things. I've been they say crazy things.
As soon as you give up the mic, you're at the mercy of whoever.
I remember one time we were partying, and I'm like, you're not going to tell this story,
And they did.
Yeah.
So don't say, hey, we can build in a time where you can just all have family members come up and talk. But if they do bring up, we'd like to do that. So, okay, what form do you want that to take? Or we want to have prepared remarks. We want to have just a few people that you want to do that, or how you want. And at the end of the day, you might get into a situation. I don't know how. I haven't thought of a way how you can basically do that if they're insistent on wanting to have open mic at the funeral. I don't know what you do. But don't encourage it, I wouldn't say, because you can create issues for you to deal with that you wouldn't if you didn't. So. All right. You guys know passages of Scripture that you can appeal to in these kinds of services, or would you like a list?
No, I'd like you to give us a list anyway.
All right. Here's just some. Psalm 23, obviously. Psalm 121. Psalm 1. 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 to 18. John 14, 1 through 6. 1 Corinthians 15, especially verses 24 and following.
1 Corinthians 15.
The resurrection chapter, 24 and following.
Would you preach 1 through 4?
Yeah, and what I have here is just 1 Corinthians 15 in excerpts. I mean,
Okay.
there's 58 verses in that chapter.
Oh, yeah. It's
So
pretty
you might
long.
want to be selective, John 5, 28 and 29. Acts 20, 32. Revelation 14, 13. Did I go too fast? Okay, sorry. Where did I lose you?
Acts, what was one in
Okay,
Acts?
Acts 20, 32.
Okay.
And then Revelation 14, 13.
14, 13. Yeah.
First Thessalonians what?
4, 13 through 18.
Christ return. Come on, Uriah.
When I have you, was it my uncle used to say, I wouldn't have you ignorant brethren. The joke loses its power with a newer translation.
Oh, you Southerners, I don't know about that. But where do you get, I just want to know where you come up with these things you say out of your mouth. You hear the words that are coming out of your mouth? I don't understand what you
I told you about staying with a Jewish lady and telling her about the wheel of God, and she goes, "Oh, I never heard of it said that way. Does it have spokes in it?" And I said, "No, will of God." So I find myself every once in a while out there preaching, people go, it's like our puppy. It's kind of, I don't get that.
Brad says some stuff too. I'm like, what does that even mean?
And all I do is just feel sorry for you guys for not getting the richness of similes and colloquialism.
Oh yeah, I don't have. I'm sorry. I'm not blessed with the richness of Southern way of talking and thinking. Sorry.
Yeah, it's,
We know you guys are all going to heaven down there.
yeah, oh yeah.
We understand.
You know, just so we all know.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
There were two friends of ours where I was invited to speak at the funeral service, and man, I felt so uncomfortable being inside with all the stuff that was going on.
Oh yeah.
Because in the Caribbean, depends on the church. It would be like a big party. It's a huge thing. They call it a going home, and they really push it.
There are a lot of
It
cultures.
must be so uncomfortable, man, just sitting there and the music and the loudness of everything that is happening.
You know, you bring up a good point. I didn't mention this back on weddings, but you know, there are some receptions I won't go to. And sometimes, sad to say, it's been situations where there's members of the church.
You mean?
Like an open bar. I'm not going to be here.
Wow.
And my personal conviction, if they're dancing, I don't want to be around that. Now, guys, I have a right to take a stand there. And I don't think there's going to be
You sure
drinking
do?
or grinding there, but you know, but it's still, I don't want to be in that environment and a part of that. And if I'm asked, I'll be very kind, but I'm going to tell them why. And some of those things are getting more frequent.
Yeah.
And they're getting more out there. And where Nariah's coming from, there's a lot of cultures where a Christian's going to be in a situation where he goes, I don't know that I can be involved with the event because it's like there's some wedding situations and funerals too. You're talking about the wake and the homegoing or different words are used to describe that.
Yeah.
It's
Normally they have.
Romans 13:13. You know,
It depends on what religion it is. Like the Hindus, they would have, I think, is it 20 days?
to the Hindus,
Yeah, the Hindus have about 20 days.
Buddhists are very
Yeah,
similar.
some days before and some days after. The weddings are a little bit different. They have their religious wedding system first, and then they have what they say English wedding after. So it takes a whole day.
Yeah.
The Hindu wedding.
And it brings up a situation that's cross-cultural. That's in any culture. You got to be careful that you're not holding hands with a situation that you don't need to be involved in.
Don't people feel the associate?
To be informed about that may mean to say, I really wish you guys well, but I can't be involved in that. Well, why not? Well, and then that gives you an opportunity to share what Scripture says on some of these matters. So,
Neal, how would you label those 9 passages you gave us? Passages for what?
they're just scriptures that you can use in either funeral or graveside services.
Oh, funeral graves.
So that's sort of not exhaustive, but it's just an idea of what text am I going to preach from for this funeral. And I gave you quite a few funeral outlines. So there are going to be maybe some other texts in there and some ideas of how to develop those and flesh those out. Romans 8 for a Christian, a great text. All right, let me just deal with the graveside here briefly. Number one, don't preach another funeral. Graveside services are meant to be very brief. How brief? I'd say 3 to 5 minutes. I have this developed under that. Don't preach another funeral. Just a couple of things. Number one, always stand at the head of the casket. Again, it's just a customary thing.
Make sure you know where the head is.
Yeah, you know, and I have often asked when we get to the graveside, and they're informing the pallbearers on how to roll them out. I'll ask if the director's at hand. I'll say, "Where's the head?" A lot of times the director will tell you, "We're going to put the head on this end." So you just go and you stand on the end where the head is. Number two, don't start until the funeral director gives you the nod. There's always some confusion as to when that is. I know who's in charge of that. You can tell who's in charge. They may be the ones that give the announcements at the funeral, the funeral home of the church building, saying we're going to proceed to such and such cemetery for the interment. All right, that person, whoever it is, I'm looking for them, and they'll know I'm looking to them because I'm looking at them. And as soon as they kind of gather everybody in, he'll give you a nod. And as soon as that happens,
What's that?
Stand and call. Stand.
how do I answer it?
I have no idea.
I wouldn't answer. He's scared.